Labour unions representing the country's state workers are likely to return to the negotiation table after the salary increment negotiation reportedly reached a deadlock. Now, the unions are demanding a 5% basic salary increment for 2022-23 financial year, while housing and also housing allowance proposed at 9% increment and another 10% increment for transport allowance for civil servants below management. Now, joining us to talk more on this matter as we discuss some of the factors that are at play in this situation is Labour analyst Herbert Jauch. Good morning, Mr. Herbert, and welcome to Good Morning Namibia.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Now, we know that the unions in the country have been at negotiation table demanding a salary increment and improvement of the conditions of service for civil servants since 2018, but it appears to be no positive income. What are your contributions or ideas with regards to this topic, and are we likely to see a way forward in terms of salary increment for the civil servants?
It's a very tricky and difficult situation now for the unions. Some years back, the former Minister of Finance announced that government might not be able to really increase the salaries of civil servants for some time, but he promised that they would at least get an inflation adjustment. In other words, although the increases would not be real wage increases, they would at least cover the increased costs of living. Now, this hasn't happened for several years now. I think about 5-6 years it hasn't happened. And that basically meant that civil servants are getting poorer. Their income has to stretch further. Every year, increases in the cost of living erode what they can buy. So in effect, their real wages are declining. And that put them under pressure. Government, on the other hand, and that's not only since COVID, but before, had a problem of rising indebtedness, and they signed a deal with the International Monetary Fund for some loan agreements. And in return, they promised and signed an agreement to say that they are containing the wage bill in the civil service. So government is under pressure from that side, number one, because of its high debt, and number two, because of agreements like the one with the IMF. And that makes these negotiations so extremely difficult.
Okay. Now, what is your take on the latest outcome of negotiations between government and the unions?
Not surprising. The unions have to get their mandate from their members, and the members obviously tell them, look, 5 years without an increment is just not acceptable. We are struggling more and more. You have to now negotiate for something substantial, and the demands are relatively modest that you've just mentioned. Okay. 5% wage benefit. On the other hand, because of government's tight financial situation, government then said, well, there is no money, the civil service is so huge, we can simply not increase at all. And that led to the deadlock that we've seen.
Okay. Now, with that historical background that you just mentioned, when last week Namibian civil servants granted any salary increment or improvement of conditions of service, and how does this affect government's position, especially with regards to these negotiations that are dating back since 2018?
Yes. And this is where the dilemma really comes to the fore now. On the one hand, the civil service has grown tremendously. On the other hand, also the service delivery provided is probably far below what it could be. And that is another aspect that hasn't been looked at. So now you sit with over 100,000 people on government's payroll. You sit with a indebtedness that's now around 70% of Namibia's GDP, whereas government announced before a cutoff line of around 30-35% at the most. So government has shot in the last few years way beyond its GDP indebtedness level. And that makes it now so extremely difficult. And of course, we've seen in other countries when you have austerity programs where government just cuts down on the expenditure, it can lead to even retrenchments in the civil service. And I think this is the fear that civil servants also have, and that puts them and their unions in a very difficult position.
Okay. But is there anything that could be done, since, if taking to what you have just mentioned now, it's rather an unfortunate situation, but could the outcome be any different considering that government is the biggest player when it comes to our economy?
Exactly. And the difference could be made by looking at the budget holistically, and where the unions would not just say we demand ABC, but they would look at the budget as a whole and say what can be done to enable us to have at least cost of living adjustments and moderate increases for civil servants, but also what can be done to improve the efficiency of the civil service in terms of service delivery to the vast majority of Namibians. And I think if one looks at those two in context and then force also government to be open about the agreement with the IMF, because to negotiate when basically you have signed already that there will be no increases for several years is pointless. That's negotiation in bad faith. Government would need to say, what are our options? What are our limitations? And the unions would then have to point out what can be done to enable an increase. Unless they do that, I would be surprised if any increase can be agreed upon.
Okay. Now, we know that the country has been having low national economic performance, and obviously this is also exacerbated by the fact of the outbreak of the COVID-19 and its impacts. Is government really in a position to afford a salary increment for civil servants? And also looking at the fact that should we really be concentrating on international commitment vis-a-vis trying to meet the needs of the people, of the local people who are actually suffering because of the ever-increasing living commodities?
Exactly. This is the trade-off that government is facing. Because we must also remember that in Namibia, most households have one key household earner, one major income earner. On income, basically the household survives. Now, if that person is squeezed, if that person's real income is eroded by inflation, by rising costs of living all the time, then it means for the whole household it becomes dire. And that is what we're seeing right now. And that's what government needs to consider, because when you look at 5-6 years without a salary adjustment, it means that in terms of buying power, civil servants have lost about 20 to 30% of their income to inflation. Now that is huge, and that explains now the pressure. On the other hand, of course, the huge size of the civil service and the huge chunk that wages already take out of the national budget is something to consider. But in terms of economics, when people have more spending power, they also use it in the local economy. It's the same principle like with a basic income grant, if that would be paid out. It's initially a higher investment or a higher payout for government, but it circulates the local economy and spent on consumer goods. And that's a crucial factor to consider when you perform like we do now, and you then have a government that's purely on austerity measures, like under structural adjustment programs, where everything gets cut. You find a downward spiral and downward pressure on the economy. And I think this is where we, at the moment, stuck in short-term thinking. Government's only position on almost everything is cut expenditure, cut expenditure. This is not aiding any economic recovery. And it's certainly not aiding civil servants and their family. And I think these are the factors to consider, and we need to have a discussion around that, and not just cut all the time at the expense of households sliding into more and more economic crisis.
Now, you mentioned the fact that civil servants and state employees have lost approximately between 20 to 30% of their buying power. From your point of view, how is it that these civil servants and state employees have been able to survive all these years without the salary increment?
Well, on the one hand, of course, generally in the civil service, the packages were not too bad. They were certainly better than in many companies in the private sector. But with these cuts over the last 5 years, simply caused by no inflation adjustments at all, it meant that at household level, situations are strained. And you can see it everywhere in the country, because civil servants are spread across, and they were often the main supplier of the household in terms of income. And they've been squeezed to the limit, and you see a lot of anger and frustration, but also knowing that even if people go on a strike, it will not automatically move government to grant increase. And we've seen that also at some of the parastatals where strike action occurred. That in a situation where expenditure is so controlled and so tight like it is now, even industrial action might not not lead to a change there. And it means that we have an economic crisis that affects households across the country now. And it's a desperate and dire situation. And I think government must also consider that there's anger growing, and that people are really struggling to make ends meet, and they're not prepared to go another few years, because it's not a temporary arrangement that we're seeing now. Government is not saying, we can't give you an increase for this year, but next year we will. They're simply saying there's no money for an increase, but that could be in 2023 and 24 the same situation. And I think civil servants have now also reached a limit where they say, well, without increases, without adjustments to rising costs of inflation, we just can't make it any longer.
Is your opinion perhaps that the lack of this adjustment, whether be it inflation or normal salary increment, is it impacting the possibility of the performance of state employees?
It will certainly demoralize people further. It will. We have already, before that, we must say, we have a problem of delivery, quality of delivery, commitment to service delivery in some ministries, very clearly, and in some regions. Now, with not having prospects of receiving salary adjustments or increases at all, it will demotivate civil servants very clearly. So we're likely to have greater problems of service delivery and commitment to work when they're just told that there are no increases in the pipeline, and they must just make do with what they have currently. So it's for government also, even in the State of the Nation address, the Prime Minister's speeches, they talked about service delivery, improving performance in the civil servant. That will be even harder if civil servants get no adjustments at all.
Okay. Now, as we conclude our conversation this morning, what are the possible impacts, especially on Namibia's fiscal, should the government's hand be forced in actually leading to an increment for civil servants?
Well, an increment would only be possible if government then has a strategy to say, how do we shift within the budget so that we grant the increment, but at the same time, we ensure that service delivery, and that is still a very crucial factor when we look at the civil servant, that the service delivery also improves at the same time. Okay. You cannot have a scenario where you have a salary increment and then you cut at other expenditure points that are needed for service delivery. So it would need a very holistic approach, looking at the budget overall, looking at the costs of an adjustment or increment, as it's called, and then saying, but we must also make sure that service delivery continues, because otherwise you have a trade-off which would, well, there's a bit more money now in the pockets of civil servants, but the price for that is paid in terms of declining service delivery and resources for other essential things. So it's a balancing act, and it would require government to look at it from a point of using the budget as a tool for economic recovery, moving away from kind of the structural adjustment of cutting just everything, and acknowledging civil servants' needs as often the main income earners of households, and therefore keeping households ticking and keeping them out of poverty. For that, it's also important. And government needs to weigh that up. You cannot be so one-dimensional. My sense is currently government's approach is very one-dimensional, and they need to rethink that and say, we need to at least adjust basic salaries of civil servants to keep pace with inflation. And at the same time, we need to improve and extend our service delivery. In times of crisis, these two are both absolutely essential.
Okay. Now, thank you very much for joining us this morning, and we hope that an amicable solution will be found.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Now, that was Labour analyst Herbert Jauch talking to us about the salary increment negotiations that have recently reached a deadlock between the unions and government. Now, stay tuned. Good Morning Namibia returns shortly after this break.